December 8, 1943. Outside a small white clapboard church in the rural town of Aliceville, Alabama, Captain Michael Thornton stood with his arms crossed, watching as 20 German prisoners of war filed quietly into the Sunday morning service. Around him stood a small group of American officers, including Major William Hoffman, commander of the Aliceville POW camp, and several local clergymen who had been summoned to witness what might be either a breakthrough in international understanding or a dangerous experiment in wartime prisoner treatment. Dressed in dark blue uniforms with PW emblazoned across the back in white letters, the Germans walked past Thornton with eyes downcast, a few nodding respectfully to the American officers. The townspeople inside the church turned to stare, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. As the last prisoner entered, a murmur rippled through the congregation. Thornton held his breath, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. What happened next would challenge everything Americans thought they knew about their enemies and transform the lives of thousands of German prisoners across the United States. This is the story of how a controversial Sunday morning church program, sparked by one army chaplain's radical act of compassion, reshaped America's approach to prisoner rehabilitation, influenced a generation of German officers, and planted seeds of democracy that would flourish in postwar Germany. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The small town of Aliceville, Alabama, population barely 2,700, had never expected to play a role in World War II. Nestled amid cotton fields and pine forests, the sleepy agricultural community was about as far from the European battlefront as one could imagine. Yet, by late 1943, it had become home to one of the largest prisoner of war camps in America, holding over 6,000 captured German soldiers, most taken during the North African campaign against Rommel's Africa Corps. For the townspeople of Aliceville, the sudden appearance of thousands of enemy soldiers was both shocking and surreal. These weren't just any enemy soldiers, they were Germans, the embodiment of Nazi terror that newsreels and war propaganda had seared into American consciousness. These were the men who had marched across Europe, who had bombed London in the Blitz, who served the Reich that had unleashed unprecedented horror upon the world. Now they were here, just outside town, separated from American families by nothing more than barbed wire and guard towers. The Aliceville camp itself was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by watchtowers and dual perimeter fences topped with barbed wire. Built rapidly in 1942 as part of America's expanding POW program, it had been designed according to the Geneva Convention standards, basic but humane. The American military had constructed over 500 such camps across the United States, housing nearly 400,000 German prisoners by war's end. This massive influx of enemy combatants onto American soil presented not just a security challenge, but a profound moral and ideological dilemma. What exactly was America's responsibility toward these men? The Geneva Convention provided clear guidelines for physical treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, but said nothing about their spiritual, psychological, or ideological needs. Were these men to be merely contained until the war's end, or could something more meaningful emerge from their captivity? This question would become increasingly urgent as the war progressed, and the full extent of Nazi indoctrination among German troops became apparent. Lieutenant James Blackwell, a 1-year-old Army chaplain from Minnesota, wrestled with this question more than most. Before the war, Blackwell had been a Lutheran minister in a small parish outside Minneapolis. He had joined the chaplain corps in 1942, believing his calling was to minister to American soldiers. But in August 1943, he received orders to report to Aliceville not to serve the guards, but to provide religious services for the German prisoners. "I was furious at first," Blackwell later wrote in his memoir. "I had joined to minister to our boys, not to comfort Nazis. My own cousin had been killed at Kasserine Pass by these same men. How could I possibly serve them?" This inner conflict reflected the broader American ambivalence toward enemy prisoners. Official policy required humane treatment, but few Americans felt any obligation beyond the minimum requirements. Blackwell arrived at Aliceville in September 1943, still deeply conflicted about his assignment. His first encounter with the German prisoners did nothing to ease his mind. As he walked through the camp, he was struck by their discipline, their erect posture, their unwavering confidence despite captivity. Many openly displayed their commitment to Nazism, keeping pictures of Hitler in their barracks and continuing to use the Heil Hitler salute among themselves when guards weren't looking. Among the prisoners, one figure in particular caught Blackwell's attention. Hauptmann, Captain Ernst Müller, a decorated Afrika Korps officer who served as the senior German officer in the camp. Müller was everything Blackwell expected a Nazi officer to be: tall, blonde, aristocratic, and seemingly unbroken by capture. His immaculate bearing and fluent English made him the natural liaison between prisoners and American authorities. What Blackwell couldn't know then was that Müller would soon become both his greatest challenge and his most important ally. The relationship between captive and captor at Aliceville was complex and evolving. The Geneva Convention permitted German prisoners to maintain their military hierarchy within the camp, with their own officers enforcing discipline. This created a shadow command structure that American authorities simultaneously relied upon and mistrusted. Senior German officers like Müller wielded enormous influence over their men, determining whether they would cooperate with American authorities or resist. In those early months, resistance was common. Subtle acts of defiant slowdowns at work details, minor sabotage, the singing of Nazi songs at night were frequent enough to create constant tension. More serious incidents occurred as well. In November 1943, guards discovered a tunnel being dug from Barracks 17, extending nearly 30 feet toward the outer fence. The following week, 3 prisoners attempted to slip away during an agricultural work detail, only to be recaptured in a nearby woods after an all-night search involving bloodhounds and local volunteers. These security concerns overshadowed any consideration of the prisoners' spiritual welfare. Camp Commander Major William Hoffman, a career Army officer from Pennsylvania, viewed religion primarily as a tool for maintaining order. "If attending services keeps them quiet and occupied, I'm all for it," he told Blackwell during their first meeting. "But don't expect me to believe these Nazis have suddenly found God." Hoffman had practical reasons for skepticism. Intelligence reports from other POW camps suggested that Nazi true believers were using religious services as cover for political meetings. In some cases, Nazi officers had threatened or beaten prisoners who showed genuine interest in American religious practices, seeing it as treasonous fraternization with the enemy. Allowing Germans to attend religious services inside the camp was one thing. Permitting them to worship alongside Americans in town was quite another. For Blackwell, the turning point came during a cold October evening in 1943. While walking near the camp perimeter, he heard singing coming from one of the barracks. Drawing closer, he recognized the melody of Silent, Night Still Nacht, being sung in German. The sound stopped him in his tracks. These were the same voices that had been singing Nazi marching songs just days before, now offering a Christmas hymn familiar to any American Christian. In that moment, Blackwell later wrote, "I realized that beneath the uniforms and the ideology were men not so different from those I had ministered to back home. Men with souls, men caught in circumstances beyond their control, men who, like all of us, needed something to believe in beyond the horror of war." This realization didn't erase the reality of what German soldiers had done in service to Hitler, but it planted a seed in Blackwell's mind about the possibility of genuine spiritual connection. The camp's existing religious program was minimal. Blackwell conducted Protestant services in a designated barracks on Sunday mornings, while a visiting Catholic priest offered Mass for Catholic prisoners. Attendance was sparse, perhaps 50 prisoners out of thousands, and those who did attend were often subjected to ridicule or threats from Nazi hardliners when they returned to their barracks. What the German prisoners couldn't know was that American authorities were developing a more sophisticated approach to their captivity. In late 1943, the War Department established a re-education program aimed at exposing German POWs to American democratic values. This highly classified initiative which would eventually be known as the Intellectual Diversion Program, sought to plant the seeds for a post-Nazi Germany by introducing prisoners to democratic principles through films, classes, and carefully selected literature. Religious practice was not officially part of this program, but forward-thinking officers recognized its potential value. A confidential memo from the Office of the Provost Marshal General, dated November 1943, noted, "Religious expression, particularly when it deviates from state-approved forms, represents a first step toward independent thinking. Prisoners who begin to question Nazi religious policies may soon question other aspects of National Socialism." Blackwell knew nothing of these broader strategic considerations. His concerns were more immediate and personal. If these men were to spend years in captivity, what would they become? Would their hatred only harden? Would they return to Germany even more committed to the ideologies that had led to war? Or could their time in America offer a different path? In November 1943, Blackwell approached Captain Müller with a proposal. Rather than conducting separate services in the camp, would some prisoners be interested in attending regular church services in Aliceville? Müller's response was coldly practical. "My men will go anywhere they are permitted, chaplain. A few hours outside the wire would be welcome regardless of the reason." His skepticism was obvious, but he agreed to compile a list of interested prisoners. When Blackwell presented the idea to Major Hoffman, the reaction was immediate and negative. "Absolutely not. These men are enemy combatants, not Sunday school students," Hoffman said. "Can you imagine what would happen if something went wrong? If a prisoner escaped during a service? Or worse, if one of them harmed an American civilian? The public outcry would end both our careers." Hoffman's concerns were legitimate. The American public had conflicted feelings about German prisoners. On one hand, reports of POWs being treated to ice cream, movies, and sports, while American boys died overseas, had generated outrage. On the other hand, many communities had come to accept the prisoners working on local farms and in factories to address wartime labor shortages. Any incident involving prisoners in a community setting could tip this delicate balance. Blackwell refused to give up. He spent weeks building support, first convincing the local ministerial association, then key community leaders. His most important ally proved to be Alice Thornton, the mayor's wife and a respected figure in town. Thornton, whose own son was fighting in Italy, argued that demonstrating American values of religious freedom and compassion, even toward enemies, represented the highest patriotism. "We're not fighting this war just to defeat Germany," she told a skeptical town council meeting. "We're fighting for certain principles. If we abandon those principles out of fear or hatred, then we've already lost something precious." By early December, Major Hoffman had reluctantly agreed to a trial run. 20 prisoners would be permitted to attend Sunday services at First Methodist Church under heavy guard. The men would be carefully selected, those with the best behavior records and no known strong Nazi sympathies. They would be transported by truck, seated away from the congregation, and returned immediately after the service. Any disruption would end the program permanently. The night before the first church visit, Captain Müller summoned the selected prisoners to the camp theatre. What he told them has been preserved in Heinrich Wolff's memoir, My Years in America, published in Germany in 1953. "Tomorrow you will represent not just yourselves, but all German soldiers. The Americans are extending a privilege unknown in any other prison camp in this war. How you conduct yourselves will determine whether this privilege continues or ends. Remember that your behavior may affect thousands of your comrades across this country." Müller then added something that surprised many of the men. "You will show these Americans the true character of German soldiers, disciplined, dignified, and respectful. We are not the barbarians they believe us to be." The morning of December 8th dawned clear and cold. The 20 selected prisoners wore their cleanest uniforms, their hair freshly cut. As they boarded the transport truck, several guards noted their nervous demeanor. These were not the cocky Afrika Korps, veterans who had arrived months earlier, but men who understood they were embarking on something unprecedented. First Methodist Church of Aliceville was a classic white clapboard building with a tall steeple, indistinguishable from thousands of similar churches across rural America. That Sunday morning, it was filled beyond capacity. Regular parishioners had been joined by curious townspeople and a contingent of reporters from newspapers as far away as Birmingham and Atlanta. Armed guards stood at every entrance and along both sides of the sanctuary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The prisoners entered silently, led by Captain Muller. They were seated in the last 4 rows, separated from the main congregation by an empty row where 2 armed guards sat facing them. The tension in the room was palpable. Some American attendees had lost loved ones in the war. Others had sons or husbands still fighting. Many had never been this close to a German soldier before. Reverend Thomas Wilson, the church's pastor, had carefully planned the service to emphasize universal Christian themes rather than patriotic elements that might seem provocative. The opening hymn was Amazing Grace, chosen because its melody and message transcended national boundaries. What no one had anticipated was the reaction of the German prisoners. As the congregation began to sing, the Germans joined in, singing the familiar tune in their own language. The sound of German words in the small Alabama church startled the Americans. Some stopped singing entirely, others sang louder, as if in competition. But by the hymn's final verse, something had changed in the atmosphere. The 2 languages, carrying the same melody and meaning, had created an unexpected harmony. During the sermon, Reverend Wilson spoke on the theme of reconciliation from the Gospel of Matthew. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. He made no direct reference to the war or to the Germans' presence, yet the application was unmistakable. Throughout the service, the prisoners maintained perfect decorum, following the order of worship as indicated in the bulletins they had been given. The true test came during the closing moments of the service when Reverend Wilson, following long-standing church tradition, invited visitors to stand and be recognized. After acknowledging several American visitors from neighboring towns, he paused, then said, "And we recognize our visitors from the Aliceville camp. We pray that God's peace finds you far from your homes." Captain Muller stood, followed by the other prisoners. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said simply, his accent thick but his dignity unmistakable. Then, in a gesture that would be recounted for years afterward, he bowed slightly to the congregation. As the Germans filed out of the church toward their waiting transport, they passed through a gauntlet of American faces. There were no smiles, no handshakes, it was too soon for that, but neither were there the hostile stares that had greeted their arrival. Something fundamental had shifted, if only slightly. What happened that December morning was not a dramatic conversion or an emotional reconciliation scene from a Hollywood film. It was something more subtle, but perhaps more significant, a moment of mutual recognition. Americans saw not faceless enemies, but individual men participating in familiar rituals. Germans experienced American religious freedom firsthand, a sharp contrast to the state-controlled churches of Nazi Germany. News of the church visit spread quickly through official and unofficial channels. Within days, the War Department received reports from intelligence officers, camp administrators, and local officials. Reactions were mixed. Some saw it as a dangerous precedent that blurred the line between captor and captive. Others recognized its potential as part of the broader re-education effort. In Aliceville itself, the experiment generated intense debate. Letters to the local newspaper reflected the community's division. "Have we forgotten Pearl Harbor so quickly?" wrote one resident. "These men were trying to kill our boys just months ago." Another countered, "I watched them sing hymns I've known all my life. It made me wonder what this war is really about, if we worship the same God." For Major Hoffman, the absence of incidents was the only metric that mattered. No escape attempts, no disruptions, no propaganda, just 20 prisoners who attended a church service and returned to camp without incident. Reluctantly, he authorized a second visit the following Sunday, this time to the Baptist church. When that too passed without incident, a regular rotation began among Aliceville's churches. By Christmas 1943, the program had expanded to allow 50 prisoners each Sunday to attend services in town. What had begun as a controversial experiment was becoming an established practice. For many prisoners, these church visits provided their first unvarnished view of American life. They saw how civilians lived, how communities functioned without constant state supervision, how religion existed independent of government control. Johann Schneider, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1941, later described the impact. In Germany, the church had become an instrument of the state. Pastors who opposed Nazi policies were arrested. Biblical teachings were twisted to support racial theories. But here, in this small American town, I saw something different. A church that spoke of peace while nations were at war, of brotherhood while armies fought. It made me question everything I had been taught. This questioning was precisely what American authorities hoped might emerge from the POW experience, though few expected it would come through church attendance. Captain Michael Thornton, initially one of the program's strongest skeptics, noted the changes in his weekly security reports. The prisoners who attended church services were less likely to participate in pro-Nazi activities within the camp. They were more likely to volunteer for work details and to cooperate with camp regulations. Most significantly, these prisoners began to serve as a counterweight to the hardcore Nazi elements within the camp population. Where once Nazi sympathizers had dominated the camp's internal culture through intimidation and social pressure, now an alternative community was forming, one that openly questioned the ideology that had led them into war and captivity. For Captain Müller, the church program represented a puzzle. As the ranking German officer in Aliceville, he had been trained to maintain military discipline and Nazi ideology among his men, even in captivity. Yet he found himself increasingly supportive of the very program that was subtly undermining that ideology. His own participation had begun as a tactical decision to monitor the prisoners and ensure they didn't embarrass themselves or him, but something unexpected had happened during those Sunday services. I went initially to observe, not to worship, Müller later wrote in a letter to Blackwell after the war. I was suspicious of American motives. I thought perhaps this was some elaborate propaganda exercise. But Sunday after Sunday, I found myself drawn to something I had nearly forgotten existed: faith separate from Führer, belief without politics. Müller's journey was not unique. By February 1944, over 300 German prisoners at Aliceville, nearly 5% of the camp population, had attended at least one church service in town. What began as a novelty, an escape from the monotony of camp life, was becoming something more profound for many. The theological differences between American and German religious practices were minimal, especially among Protestants. The differences in how religion operated in society, however, were striking. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a Lutheran from Saxony, expressed his astonishment in a letter to his family that was intercepted by camp censors. On Sundays here, the Americans go to whatever church they choose. Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, it matters not to the government. There are no SS men taking notes on who attends. The pastors speak freely, even criticizing their government's policies sometimes. It is as if church and state exist in separate worlds. This observation that religion could exist independent of state control directly contradicted Nazi efforts to subordinate churches to party authority. In Germany, the Nazi regime had created the German Christians movement to align Protestant churches with Nazi ideology, persecuting the dissenting confessing church led by figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Many German soldiers had never questioned this arrangement until experiencing American religious freedom firsthand. Blackwell recognized the opportunity before him. With Major Hoffman's reluctant permission, he began organizing discussion groups where prisoners who had attended services could reflect on their experiences. These sessions, held in the camp's educational building, were carefully structured to avoid direct political content. Instead, they focused on theological questions that inevitably led to broader considerations. We discussed the concept of individual conscience, Blackwell recalled. The idea that each person bears moral responsibility for their actions, regardless of orders received. This wasn't political indoctrination, it was basic Christian teaching, but its implications for men raised in an authoritarian system were revolutionary. As winter gave way to spring in 1944, the church program expanded beyond Sunday services. American congregations began inviting small groups of prisoners to church suppers, choir practices, and Bible studies. These, more intimate settings allowed for genuine conversation between Americans and Germans, breaking down stereotypes on both sides. For Aliceville residents, the controlled interaction with German prisoners transformed enemies into individuals. Martha Simmons, who taught Sunday school at First Baptist, described this evolution. At first, I could only see the uniform, the enemy. But then you notice one boy has his mother's address sewn inside his jacket collar. Another keeps a worn photograph of his sweetheart. They laugh at the same jokes our boys would laugh at. They miss their homes just like our boys do. For the prisoners, these interactions provided a window into American life that contradicted years of Nazi propaganda. They saw black and white worshippers in the same churches segregated by custom, but united in faith during an era when German ideology preached racial separation as divine law. They witnessed democratic processes in church business meetings, where even the pastor's proposals could be questioned or rejected by the congregation. Not everyone welcomed these developments. Within the camp, a hardcore group of Nazi loyalists viewed the church attendees with growing hostility. Led by Oberleutnant Werner Kruger, a former Hitler Youth leader before the war, they maintained that participating in American religious services constituted treason against the fatherland. These church visits are nothing but American propaganda, Kruger told his followers. They show you their wealth, their comfort, their so-called freedom to make you doubt the Führer and the Reich. Those who attend are traitors to Germany. The intimidation began subtly: social isolation, whispered threats, minor vandalism of personal belongings, but by April 1944 it had escalated. 3 prisoners returning from an Easter service were ambushed near the camp latrines. They were beaten severely, with one suffering a broken jaw. The message carved into the back of one victim's hand was clear: "Traitor." Major Hoffman responded with swift action, placing Kruger and 6 suspected accomplices in isolation. But the incident revealed the deepening ideological fault lines within the prisoner population. What had begun as a simple religious outreach was becoming a battleground for the prisoners' future loyalties. "We're seeing a war within the war," Blackwell told Captain Thornton after the Easter incident. "These men are fighting over what Germany will become after Hitler. Those who've glimpsed alternatives to Nazism are threatening to those who have built their identity around it." This assessment aligned with reports from other POW camps across America. A classified intelligence summary from May 1944 noted, "Religious activities appear to be serving as an entry point for democratic ideas. Prisoners who participate in religious programs show markedly decreased support for Nazi ideology and increased openness to democratic concepts." By mid-1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy and the rapid advance across France dominated news at Aliceville. Fresh German prisoners began arriving from the European theatre, bringing stories of German cities in ruins and the Wehrmacht in retreat. These new arrivals found a camp population already divided between Nazi loyalists and those increasingly receptive to American values. For Captain Müller, this division presented both a challenge and an opportunity. As the senior German officer, he was responsible for maintaining order among the prisoners. Yet his own views had evolved significantly since witnessing the church program's impact. In August 1944, he made a decision that would transform the camp. Using his authority as senior officer, Müller formally requested that religious services be held inside the camp for prisoners who could not attend the town churches due to space limitations. Moreover, he volunteered to personally lead a Bible study for German officers, focusing on the theological foundations of human rights and individual conscience. This request sent shockwaves through both American and German camp hierarchies. To Nazi hardliners, it represented Müller's complete betrayal. To American authorities, it offered unexpected support for their re-education efforts. Major Hoffman, recognizing the strategic value, approved the request immediately. "If Müller wants to undermine Nazi ideology for us, I say let him," Hoffman told Blackwell. "He'll accomplish more than 100 American instructors could." The first in-camp service drew over 500 prisoners, nearly 10 times the number who had been able to attend town churches. Müller himself stood before his fellow officers, men who had once saluted him as a decorated Afrika Korps commander, and spoke about his spiritual journey since arriving in Aliceville. "I believed, as you did, that strength was the only virtue that mattered," he told them. "I believed that Germany's destiny was to rule through force. I no longer believe these things. I have seen another way, one where strength protects rather than oppresses, where faith serves humanity rather than the state." Oberleutnant Kruger, recently released from isolation, sat in the back row during this speech. His face remained impassive, but the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. The ideological battle for Germany's future was playing out in a prison camp in Alabama, and both sides recognized its significance. As 1944 drew to a close, the church program's impact extended beyond spiritual matters. Prisoners who participated began voluntarily attending the camp's educational offerings, English language classes, American history lectures, vocational training. These programs, part of the official re-education effort, had previously struggled to attract participants. Now they flourished as an extension of the church community. Johann Schneider, the former schoolteacher, began teaching fellow prisoners about American constitutional principles, drawing parallels between religious freedom and broader democratic rights. The same principles that allow churches to operate independently of government control, respect for individual conscience, limits on state power also support democracy, he explained in sessions that blended theology and political philosophy. American intelligence officers monitoring these developments were astounded. What had begun as a chaplain's outreach effort had evolved into a grassroots democratic movement within the prison camp. Captain Thomas Reynolds, an intelligence officer assigned to evaluate the re-education program, reported, "The church initiative has accomplished more in 6 months than our formal efforts achieved in a year. These men aren't just learning about democracy, they're practicing it in their discussion groups." Christmas 1944 marked a watershed moment for the Aliceville experiment. With the Battle of the Bulge raging in Europe, Hitler's desperate final offensive tension among the prisoners reached new heights. Nazi loyalists, energized by news of the German offensive, became more aggressive in their intimidation. Yet the Christmas Eve service in camp drew over 1,000 prisoners, the largest attendance to date. For this special service, Reverend Wilson from First Methodist had been invited to preach inside the camp. His sermon, delivered to a sea of blue German uniforms in the camp theatre, addressed the universal longing for peace. He spoke of the angel's proclamation, "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men," as a divine mandate that transcended national boundaries. As the service concluded, something unprecedented occurred. Captain Müller stepped forward with a proposal. The German prisoners would like to contribute to Aliceville's Christmas charity drive for needy families. From their modest earnings in camp work programs, 80 cents per day for most, they had collected over $3,000 for local children's presents and food baskets. The gesture stunned the American officers present. These were enemy soldiers, many still devoted to their country's cause, choosing to help American families during wartime. Major Hoffman, never an enthusiastic supporter of the church program, found himself moved nearly to tears as he accepted the donation on behalf of the town. In 25 years of military service, he later wrote, "I've never witnessed anything that better captured the true spirit of Christmas. These men are still our prisoners, still technically our enemies until the war ends. Yet they've shown a humanity that transcends the conflict." The Christmas charity became front-page news across Alabama. The Birmingham News ran the headline, "German POWs donate thousands to Alabama poor." Readers who had viewed all Germans as Nazi fanatics were forced to reconsider their assumptions. Letters poured into the newspaper. many from families with sons fighting in Europe, expressing amazement at this evidence of common humanity. For the prisoners themselves, the charity drive represented a reclamation of identity separate from Nazism. Hans Müller, no relation to the captain, a young private from Bavaria, expressed this sentiment in his journal. For years we have been told that to be German is to be Nazi. Today, we showed that we can be German and still act with Christian charity toward those called enemies. Perhaps this is the true Germany, not what Hitler has made us. This emerging separation between German identity and Nazi ideology represented exactly what American re-education efforts hoped to achieve. Captain Reynolds noted in his January 1945 assessment, "The prisoners are increasingly distinguishing between loyalty to Germany as a nation and support for the Nazi regime. This crucial distinction will be essential for building a democratic Germany after the war." As 1945 began, the church program's success attracted attention at the highest levels of the American military. The War Department dispatched observers to study the Aliceville model, considering its application to other POW camps. What they found was a program that had evolved far beyond religious services into a comprehensive approach to democratic re-education. The numbers told a compelling story. At Aliceville, over 30% of prisoners now regularly attended religious services either in town or in camp. Of these, approximately 70% also participated in the camp's educational programs. Incidents of Nazi symbolism and propaganda within the camp had decreased by nearly 60% since the program began. Most significantly, intelligence reports indicated that former participants were actively challenging Nazi ideology among their fellow prisoners. Colonel William Davison, heading the War Department's Special Observer Team, summarized his findings bluntly. "What's happening at Aliceville isn't just religious conversion, it's democratic conversion. These men are experiencing freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of assembly. They're practicing democracy before they've even learned the theory." For Lieutenant Blackwell, this evolution validated his original instinct that spiritual outreach could transform enemies into potential allies. Yet he remained realistic about the challenges ahead. In a letter to his former seminary professor, he wrote, "We are not creating Americans here. These men will return to Germany when the war ends, loyal to their homeland. But they will return with a first-hand understanding of democratic principles and religious freedom. They may become the foundation for a new Germany." Captain Müller's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The once proud Nazi officer had become an open advocate for democratic principles. In February 1945, he took an unprecedented step. He formally requested permission to renounce his Nazi Party membership. Such renunciations were rare among officer prisoners, who typically maintained at least the appearance of loyalty to avoid post-war repercussions for their families in Germany. "I can no longer in good conscience maintain even nominal association with an organization whose principles I have come to reject completely," Müller wrote in his application. "My experiences here have convinced me that Germany's future lies in democratic governance and religious freedom, not in the totalitarianism I once served." This public renunciation enraged the Nazi faction within the camp. Oberleutnant Kruger and his followers saw it as the ultimate betrayal, especially coming from their senior officer. The threat to Müller was so severe that American authorities transferred him to a special camp in Rhode Island designated for anti-Nazi German prisoners, where he would be protected from reprisals. Before departing Aliceville, Müller addressed the camp congregation one final time. His words, recorded by Chaplain Blackwell, revealed the depth of his transformation. "I came to America a prisoner of war. I will leave a prisoner still, but freed in a more profound sense. I have discovered that true strength lies not in domination but in service, not in hatred but in understanding. When Germany rises again, and it will, I pray it rises with these values at its heart." As spring 1945 arrived, news of German defeats on all fronts reached the camp daily. The prisoners listened to radio reports of the Allied crossing of the Rhine, the fall of city after city, the Soviet advance from the east. For Nazi loyalists like Kruger, These reports were either American propaganda or temporary setbacks. For the church group, they signaled the approaching end of a nightmare and the possibility of returning to rebuild a different Germany. On the 12th of April 1945, news of President Roosevelt's death reached Aliceville. The prisoners' reaction revealed how far many had come. Hundreds lined up to sign a condolence book for the fallen American leader, the very man their nation had declared its greatest enemy. The camp theatre held a memorial service where Captain Ludwig Biermann, who had replaced Müller as senior German officer, paid tribute to Roosevelt's leadership. Even as he fought against our nation, we recognize in President Roosevelt a man who upheld principles that transcend national boundaries, Biermann said. His advocacy for freedom of religion and freedom from fear represents values that all humanity should cherish. For American observers, this memorial service demonstrated the program's success more powerfully than any statistic could. Enemy soldiers paying sincere tribute to an American president showed a fundamental shift in worldview. The prisoners were distinguishing between opposing a nation in war and respecting its legitimate values, a crucial distinction for the post-war world being born through the conflict. The 8th of May, 1945, VE Day. As celebrations erupted across America, the Aliceville camp experienced complex emotions. For the prisoners, Germany's unconditional surrender meant defeat for their homeland, but also the end of Nazi terror and the hope of eventual return to their families. The news of Hitler's suicide days earlier had already confirmed that the Third Reich was finished. Major Hoffman, mindful of these mixed feelings, authorized a special service of reconciliation at the camp chapel. Unlike previous services focused on specific denominations, this gathering welcomed all prisoners and staff, regardless of faith tradition. Chaplain Blackwell, working with Reverend Wilson and 2 other town ministers, designed a service centered on healing and reconstruction. Over 2,000 prisoners attended nearly 1/3 of the camp's population. They sat alongside American guards and officers, no longer separated by empty rows or armed sentries. The symbolic change was not lost on anyone present. The war was over, new relationships were beginning. Reverend Wilson addressed the gathering with words that acknowledged both the past conflict and the potential future. For years, our nations have seen each other only through the lens of war. Today, we begin the harder work of peace. As you have worshipped with us, learned with us, even contributed to our community's welfare, you have shown that common ground exists between our peoples. In the weeks following VE Day, the Aliceville program received its most significant official recognition. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and soon-to-be military governor of the American occupation zone in Germany, requested a comprehensive report on the church initiative and its outcomes. His interest was not merely academic, he was seeking models for democratizing post-war Germany. The report, compiled by Captain Reynolds with input from Major Hoffman and Lieutenant Blackwell, documented the program's evolution and impact. Beyond the statistics on attendance and decreased Nazi activity, it emphasized the organic development of democratic values among participants. Unlike traditional re-education efforts that lecture prisoners on democratic principles, Reynolds wrote, the church program allowed them to experience these principles firsthand. They witnessed free religious expression, participated in open discussion groups, voted on community initiatives within the camp, and engaged with American civilians as individuals rather than enemies. These experiences proved more persuasive than any curriculum. For the prisoners themselves, the program's impact would continue long after they left Aliceville. As Germany entered its darkest hour, defeated, occupied, divided, and facing starvation in many regions, the knowledge that not all Americans viewed Germans as irredeemable enemies provided crucial hope. The relationships formed through the church program created a foundation for reconciliation that would help shape the post-war era. By August 1945, preparations were underway to repatriate most German POWs. For the men of Aliceville, this meant returning to a homeland many barely recognized from reports cities, in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, borders redrawn, and the nation itself divided into occupation zones. They would return as defeated soldiers to a defeated nation. Yet many carried something precious, first-hand experience with democratic principles and religious freedom. Before the first group's departure, the town of Aliceville organized a farewell dinner at First Methodist Church. 100 prisoners who had been regular attendees at town services were invited to break bread one final time with the American congregations who had welcomed them. The atmosphere was solemn yet hopeful, former enemies acknowledging that they had become something like friends. Johann Schneider, speaking on behalf of the prisoners, expressed gratitude that went beyond mere politeness. "You could have treated us only as enemies, and by the laws of war, that would have been just. Instead, you saw us as fellow humans, as souls with the same needs and hopes as your own. This recognition of common humanity is something I will carry back to Germany, something that gives me hope for our future relations." Mayor Robert Thornton, who had initially opposed allowing prisoners into town churches, offered a response that captured his own journey. "When this program began, I saw only German uniforms. Today, I see men, sons, brothers, husbands who happen to have been born in a different country and fought on a different side. If this transformation could happen here, in a small Alabama town during wartime, perhaps there is hope for true peace between our nations." The repatriation process began in September 1945. As each group of prisoners prepared to depart, Lieutenant Blackwell presented them with English-language Bibles gifts from the congregations they had visited. Inside each Bible was a handwritten note, "May the peace that passes understanding guide you as you rebuild your homeland." These Bibles would become treasured possessions for many former prisoners, tangible reminders of the unexpected spiritual journey they had experienced in captivity. Some would later use them to establish new congregations in post-war Germany, congregations committed to democratic principles and international reconciliation. As the last prisoners departed in early 1946, Aliceville returned to its pre-war quiet. The massive camp that had housed 6,000 German POWs stood empty, soon to be dismantled for salvage materials. Yet the town had been permanently changed by the experience. Residents who had initially viewed all Germans as Nazi fanatics had discovered the complexity behind the uniform. Churches that had reluctantly opened their doors to enemy prisoners had found their own faith deepened through the encounter. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.